Hey there, my name is Pastor Preston. I'm the creative pastor here at Generation Church, and I'm so glad that you found this message today. However you made your way here, I hope that it's exactly what you need for this moment and this time that you're walking through right now in your life. I believe that anytime God's Word intersects our lives, it's powerful enough to make a difference. And so that's what I hope that this message does for you today. This series that we're in right now is called Bread Circuses. So, hey, we have a value here that we say we will lean in, which means that anytime we listen to the Word of God, we're going to lean in, we're going to listen, we're going to write down and take notes and things that we can come back to. So grab your Bible, your notebook, your pen, and get ready for this message.
Excited because we are wrapping up a series today. We are closing out like one chapter, and Pastor Brandon's going to be kicking off a new series next week that I'm really looking forward to. But he went on sabbatical. Pastor Brandon went on a sabbatical, and he came back, and man, he was pumped coming back, and he, on this sabbatical, was wrestling through like the culture that our world is in versus the culture that we're called to be in, the culture that Jesus calls us to, this kingdom culture. And so we've been wrestling over the last few weeks about this tension between these two cultures. Like, he specifically kicked off the series with this Bread Circuses title. And I know it's a little bit weird. It's a phrase we don't often use, but in history, it's pretty famous. There was this satirical poet from Rome, who his name's Juvenal, and he said this. He said, "Everything now restrains itself and anxiously hopes for just two things, bread and circuses." He was basically saying, like, every value that they had, that they were willing to let it go so that they could simply be fed and they could be entertained. And so Brandon has been walking us through over the last few weeks. Pastor Preston shared one of the weeks, and we were talking about how do we live in a world where our values are constantly in tension. These kingdom values and this culture's values, this worldly culture's values. Like, we've been talking about how do we make godly values matter in a society where God doesn't. And then we've also been addressing how, like, our values are super important because everything rises and falls with it. So, like, we've been wrestling through different conversations. We've talked about, like, our mindsets. We've talked about worldviews. We've talked about compromising our beliefs. We've talked about families, and we've talked about marriages. We've talked about generational issues that we see play out because we have the wrong filter. We're looking at it through a world filter instead of a kingdom filter. We've talked about how we have misplaced identities, and last week we even discussed serving. Well, today we're going to continue talking about this collision of culture. We're going to talk about a topic that really, it's a topic where we see these cultures collide almost on a daily basis. Almost on a daily basis. And that is, we're going to talk about our money. Now, I know some of you, like, you get uncomfortable with the idea. Some of us, the minute we think about, like, money and God and church, like, it's super uncomfortable. But, like, just think about that. The uncomfortability of it is an example of the cultures colliding. It's an example of how you've been conditioned or you've been taught that, like, hey, this is not like a spiritual issue. Well, let's just sit in that for a second. Okay, so America statistically is the third largest country in the world, population-wise. Okay, third largest in the world. In 2020, a pandemic year, $240 billion was spent on advertisements to get you to do something. Either to buy something or to vote a certain way or to change your mindset. $240 billion. That's a lot of zeros on a calculator. Translates to about $700 a person to manipulate you and manipulate me into something. So let's just process that for a second. How much money can be made off of us if that much money is spent to persuade us? How much money can be made off of being in a political position if that much money is spent to sway us to vote for somebody? Now, let's contrast this for a second, okay? Jesus talked about money. For those of you who maybe this is just weird, Jesus talked about money a lot. Jesus had 39 different parables where he would share and he would bring kingdom principles to life. The first thing he talked the most about was the kingdom of God. And then the second thing he talked about was money. He actually talked more about money than heaven or hell. Man, that's got to be a reason spiritually that he would spend that much time talking about money. See, we're comfortable being sold, but we're not really comfortable talking about it in a spiritual sense. And that's where we're going to hang out today, okay? So I want to encourage you to breathe, relax. Maybe you're like preachers after my wallet. You can either sit on it if you want. You can lock it in your purse, however you need to do to protect it. Because I promise you, I am not here for your wallet at all. But if you lean into this conversation, I believe it can change your life. I believe like if we have a kingdom perspective of money, it's going to change everything. And that's what we're going to hang out with and talk about today. So we're going to look at actually an Old Testament story where we see these monetary cultures colliding. We're going to take a look at an Old Testament story where there's like God's way and then the people's way. And we're going to see how it works out. So if you've got a Bible, we're going to be hanging out in Exodus. It's the second book of your Bible. If you want to scroll there, you can follow along on the Generation Church app. They'll put it on the screen. But if you do want to follow along, we're going to be in Exodus, specifically Exodus 32. Okay? So before we get there, Exodus means like an exit. So like they're leaving something. So what are they leaving? The nation of Israel at this time, it was a small nomadic group of people who followed the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. These were the patriarchs of their faith. So these were people from their past. It was people who built this family at this point, this nomadic nation state. And Jacob has an encounter with God, and they change his name to Israel. So that's the people of Israel. It's the people of Jacob. So these people find themselves in slavery. They find themselves in bondage in Egypt. And they're in bondage until this man named Moses says enough is enough, and he gets called, he gets drawn into leading the people out of Egypt. And so he begins to lead them out of Egypt, and then there's some really cool stories that take place, like God empowers him, God resources him. He goes and he confronts Pharaoh. Pharaoh was the leader of Egypt at the time. So he confronts Pharaoh, and like miracles happen. Like crazy stuff happens that like, only God stuff could happen. Like that's what happens. And so Pharaoh finally lets the people go. So they start heading out of Egypt, and then all of a sudden Pharaoh changes his mind because, hey, there's my whole slave labor force. Like this probably isn't the best economic decision for Egypt. So he changes his mind. The Bible literally says his heart is hardened. So he goes after them, and he sort of, he basically traps them at the Red Sea, and then God does another miracle. The Red Sea parts. The nation of Israel, they go across. Pharaoh chases after him, and then the waters collapse, and the Pharaoh's army gets wiped out. Moses leads them to a mountain. And at this mountain, he says, wait. I'm going to go up and I'm going to commune with God, and all you have to do is wait. Now, let's be honest. Sometimes isn't waiting hard? Like sometimes isn't like the waiting, especially like, hey, I'm waiting for a paycheck. I'm waiting for a blessing. I'm waiting for that next thing that I want. Sometimes waiting is super hard. Some of you kids are like, I already know how many days it is to Christmas, and I'm marking it down. Some of you adults know exactly how many days it is to Christmas. Let's be real. The 3 days it takes for something to come on Amazon, it's like, oh. Like the waiting sometimes is really hard. And we're going to see that like it was hard for these people too. In Exodus 32, it says, when the people saw how long it was taking Moses to come back down the mountain, they gathered around Aaron. Come on, they said, make us some gods who can lead us. We don't know what happened to this fellow Moses who brought us here out of the land of Egypt. So Aaron said, take the gold rings from the ears of your wives and sons and daughters and bring them to me. That's really weird, but it's also really important. We'll come back to it. All the people took the gold rings from their ears and brought them to Aaron. Then Aaron took the gold, melted it down, and molded it into a shape of a calf. When the people saw it, they exclaimed, "O Israel, these are the gods who brought you out of the land of Egypt." And Aaron saw how excited the people were, so he built an altar in front of the calf. Then he announced, "Tomorrow we will have a festival to the Lord." The people got up early the next morning to sacrifice burnt offerings and peace offerings. After this, they celebrated with feasting and drinking, and they indulged in pagan revelry. They indulged in bread and circuses. Like, man, like, how do you get to this point? Because it's really interesting. Like, not only are they here, but they're setting up like this culture that keeps repeating itself, this culture that becomes cyclical all throughout the Old Testament. This culture, it's a culture that they've wrestled through. It's a culture that Jesus came to broke, but then we slip back into it out of our sin nature. We slip back into this culture, even to today, like we still wrestle with it. And it's a culture of depravity. It looks something like this. It looks like idolatry. Idolatry leads to bondage. Bondage, if it's handled appropriately, it eventually leads to blessing. And then blessings can lead us back in to idolatry. Man, like it's crazy to think of it like this. But so many times, this is this world's culture of money that we live in. So many times, this is like just the world's culture in general. Like it pulls us into an idolatrous state. It pulls us away from worshiping God, and all of a sudden we start worshiping calves. Now, I know like you're like, I haven't ever done that. Have you? Maybe we'll see on that one, okay? How do you think they got there? Like, how did they go from like bondage to miracle after miracle after miracle to like, hey, that cow looks pretty good. Aaron, you did a pretty good job. And it's a slow fade. It's a slow process. Like the God of deliverance, the God of miracle after miracle, now all of a sudden he's not enough. And man, like we hate to say it that way, but like that's really sometimes where we can find ourselves at. It's like, yes, we're supposed to worship God. Yes, we come in here and we sing the cool songs. And yes, we have God in our hearts. And then all of a sudden, like there's this slow fade. There's this fade that takes us to a different direction. So let's just see how they got there. So the nation of Israel was in Egypt for over 400 years, roughly 400 to 430 years. Scholars believe the bondage period lasted roughly 300 to 350 years. So most of the time they were in Egypt, they were slaves. Like they had no free will. They had no ability to do what they wanted. They weren't blessed. They were in bondage. Now the slow fade started 17 years after they got there. And it started by them being pressured to serve Egypt in their public works programs. Basically like, hey, why don't you start doing some of this stuff? Y'all are here. Why don't you start making some roads? You know what? We would be really helpful if y'all would start making bricks for some pyramids. And then just like them, so many of us, we have a slow fade into bondage, except our bondage most of the time is financial. Most of the time, the things that hold us captive are our bills. They're our debt. They're our stuff. And I know, like, we like to think of like, I'm the master of my castle. Like, I'm in dominion over all this stuff. Really? Maybe. Maybe not. How do we get there? How do we get in bondage? It's just one decision after the next, one slow fade to the next. It's one too many credit card swipes before you really notice what that credit card bill is. It's one too many swipes of the debit card before you realize, hey, I just spent money that should have went somewhere else instead of here. So now I've got to make a poor decision in order to be able to pay the thing that I'm indebted to. Maybe it's the purchase that you have enough money for the thing, but you don't really take into account the carrying costs that come with it. Carrying costs are like you can afford the car, but insurance comes with it. Maybe you can afford the vacation, but what about all the stuff you do on vacation? It's not just a hotel. Maybe it's I can afford the timeshare, but I didn't know it had an annual maintenance fee. And some of y'all are like cussing me in your mind because I just reminded you of poor financial decisions you've made. Maybe it's not that one loan, but it's the multiple loans that take all your cash flow, which puts you into bondage. Like, man, like it happens. Maybe it's the purchase you made, and it wasn't a bad purchase, but now you're enslaved to that purchase. Think about it like this, like a dog. Man, puppies are so cute, right? Like most people like puppies unless you're like an evil person. But you know what happens? They grow up, and now all of a sudden they have to be fed. Now all of a sudden they have to be walked. Now all of a sudden you actually like can't do whatever you want because like that thing's got to be fed and walked multiple times a day. And the thing that you were once excited about becomes a thing that is now owning you. Have you ever tried to like board a dog? Like it costs more to put the dog in a hotel than it does for you to be in a hotel. House, man, the house is so cool, but you got to mow the yard almost all the time. Man, I didn't mow my yard for like 3 weeks because it rained for 2.5 weeks, and then it was like, we lost a kid somewhere. Man, like these things happen, and it happens It happens like we get in bondage the exact same way the Israelites got in bondage. It's because of a lack of margin. Check this out. So we're going to zoom out. Genesis chapter 41, if you want to take a note, maybe you're familiar with the story. So the nation of Israel ends up in Egypt. But how did they get there? Like they got there because they didn't have margin. In 41 of Genesis, it says, so with severe famine everywhere, Joseph at this time, who is a Hebrew living in Egypt, it's a really cool story, go take a look at it. He's the viceroy, he's the number 2 in command of Egypt. And so Joseph opened up the storehouses and distributed grain to the Egyptians. For the famine was severe throughout the land of Egypt. And people from all around came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because the famine was severe throughout the world. We're going to keep going into 42. When Jacob heard that the grain was available, remember Jacob, the dude whose name becomes Israel? When Jacob heard the grain was available in Egypt, he said to his sons, why are you standing around looking at one another? I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy enough grain to keep us alive. Otherwise, we will die. So just process this for a second. If they don't have food, they're about to die. So they have so little margin, so little resources that they're about to make a decision. Now, here's another thing to process. Egypt had resources. Egypt had margin. Here's another way to sort of look at this. It says that people from all around came to Egypt, but only one people stayed in Egypt. Man, something happens out of this lack of margin. See, a lack of margin led them into bondage, and a lack of margin leads us into financial bondage. And so how do we overcome bondage? How do we overcome financial bondage? We do it with margin. Margin is like you having enough. You not spending everything that you have. So like, here's some ways that you can build margin. I just don't want to tell you like some financial things and yada, and like not a way that you can like live it out. So how can you have margin in your life? And how can I have margin in my life? Create a budget. Create a financial plan. And I know that could sound like horrible. Like some of you are like, oh, I know what I'm doing with my money. Like I make this much money, I pay these many bills, and if I have money left over, we go out to eat. And then like the next week, you do the exact same thing. And like that doesn't really work. It doesn't get you out of this bondage, out of this cycle, out of this rat race. Like, man, make a budget, have a financial plan, and then live by it. Like, here's another way you can like build margin. Live on less than you make. Like, don't spend everything that you have. And I know that's really hard, right? Like, it's hard to be like, hey, I see it, I want it, I can afford it, like, I'm going to get it. And here's why it's hard. Because you need to prepare for rainy days. That's the other thing. Prepare for rainy days. You need margin because rainy days are coming. There's this principle called Murphy's Law. Anything that can go wrong will go wrong. You have an air conditioning unit, it will go out. If you haven't bought one, they're expensive. Like things will happen. Here's a way you can sort of test if you've got margin. If I asked you right now for $100, like how easy could you get it? Now some of you are like, I knew he was, no, I don't want your money, but think about it. How easy could you come up with $100? Like it sort of starts to reveal how much margin you have. If you had an emergency right now and you needed $1,000, do you start sweating? Do you start thinking, which one of the kids do I like least that I could sell? That one. Been looking for a reason to get rid of the cat. People don't want your cat. If you had to come up with $5,000, $10,000, like when do you start getting uncomfortable? And it shows you like the degree of margin that you have. It shows you how much risk that you're able to absorb. It shows you like what you can do in a rainy day. Because here's the thing, America is just under 240 years old. There has been 48 economic recessions in American history. It averages to just about 5 every 5 years. Okay, so it's easy to see this and say, Joseph knew margin. Joseph knew there was a famine coming, so he was able to prepare for it. Joseph knew that this stuff was happening. Here's what I'm telling you. You should know it too. It's not always going to be sunny and a high of 75. Like there's moments where like it's going to be bad, and if you don't have margin, you're going to find yourself in financial bondage. What does that look like? It means you're going to go to the bank and get a loan you can't afford. It means you're going to go to a tote-the-note lot and get a car instead of being able to get one either through a car lot or being able to pay cash for it. Tote-the-note means you're going to get like really, really high interest rates. It means you're going to go to a payday advance place to get a loan. And like all of these things put you in financial bondage. So like how can you build margin? Budgets. Live on less than you make. Know that the rainy days are coming because you need to be able to endure it. And I know that this is like not the cool, sexy thing to hear at church. Live on less than what you make. Like this is a principle that can like drastically change your family tree. When we talk about resurrecting family trees, how many of them got rotted out because they were in financial bondage? Man, this can like change your family tree. It can change your whole trajectory of your life. I know it's one thing to say, it's a whole another thing to do. Like, I don't like building margin. Like, who likes having money and just sort of, like, I remember as a kid, like, hearing things like, you're letting money burn a hole in your pocket. You're almost conditioned to go get rid of it. But like, man, there is a power to changing your mindset to actually enjoying seeing your money grow in your pocket instead of your money being gone out of your pocket. Like, so we have to figure out a way to build margin. And let's be real, it's not easy. It's not easy, but there's some hard things you can do that can help you. There's some ways we want to help you. As a church, we offer small groups that are financial peace-based small groups. It's a Dave Ramsey system. It's a system that can help you come out of financial bondage. I don't know if you're familiar with Jonathan and Tabitha Key. They're phenomenal small group leaders in our church. Like, they can help walk you through systems and a way to like get you out of bondage and help you to have margin in your life. Like, that's one simple thing that you can do. Here's another way that we can help you. We offer one-on-one financial coaching. You know how many times people have asked for one-on-one financial coaching? 0. Oh, you don't need to do that at the church. You've got people in your life. You're like, oh, my mom's got so-and-so who, like, she taught us how to use money. Like, hey, this is some free advice, okay? Stop taking financial advice from broke people. Okay? Like, if nothing else will change your life, Jesus is awesome. Stop taking financial advice from broke people. Like, you look, oh, like, I like what their life looks like. Like, I'm going to go do what they do. Like, you don't know what they did. You don't know how much debt somebody might be in. You don't know the bondage they have. You don't know the way they got set up to have their story. Like, go find somebody that you trust who's a little further in life than you are and talk to them. Like, I think I'm pretty good with money, but let me tell you a secret. I get financial advice from people, and they're not broke. I get financial advice from coaches, some of them here in the church. There are some sages in this church that like are further than I am, that they've lived life longer than me. And I talk to them about, what do I do with my wife and my money? How do I not get back into financial bondage? What does it look like a little further down the road than where I'm at? I've got friends outside of the church that I'm able to get coaching from. Like, find somebody that you trust. And this is stuff we offer. Like, there are several people in the church that I would feel really confident to tell you, go listen to them and they'll help you with your money. Now, here's another thing that we offer that like people rarely take us up on when they need it. Like, we offer financial assistance. Like, sometimes like margin's hard to find. Sometimes like you've got like an emergency and like, hey, this is going to lead you to a tote-the-note lot or something bad or a payday loan. We offer financial help. You know when people usually ask for it? When it's too late. People usually ask for it the day before their electricity is about to get shut off. And it's like, your electricity getting shut off is a symptom. It's not the root problem. But you've allowed yourself to get to the point to where you need the root problem. You're not willing to let the root problem to be fixed. You're willing to solve like these things that you think are the problem. Like, maybe the next step, and maybe this is the thing for you, is to like be willing to ask for help. The church is here to be able to help you find margin. Like, Joseph was able to have margin because he prepared for it. Joseph was able to weather the rainy day, weather the 7 years of famine because he prepared for it. And man, it is hard. It is super hard because margin is made with discipline. Like, my wife and I, we have margin. And margin looks like this. Man, I could go eat anywhere I want. Like, I spent $10 for 4 days worth of lunches this week. And I'm not saying $10 every day. I'm saying 4 days for $10. 3 of those was eating fried bologna sandwiches upstairs in the air fryer. Was it great? Yes, because it was $10 and it means I have margin. Like margin is one of those things that you have to fight for. You have to be willing to do the hard things so that you can have it. But man, here's the thing, like the only time you're ever going to shift your mindset to building margin instead of spending all of your money is when you get to the place where like the discipline is worth it because you've had enough. When you get to the place to where like, I'm going to change something. And see, that's where Israel was at. Israel was at the place where like Moses comes and he's had enough. He has this holy discontent. He gets called, he gets empowered and resourced by God, and he leads them into a season of blessings. The nation of Israel sheds the yoke of slavery and they walk into freedom. And freedom looks like this. Freedom looks like you can do whatever you want. Like you can eat whatever you want. You can buy whatever you want. Now here's the crazy thing. Most of the time, people who are living in a season of freedom know that they don't need that. They know they don't have to have that. So Israel, after 300 years, could finally do whatever they wanted. And Moses said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to go worship at the foot of this mountain. Before that even happened, God told them, I want you to remember this bondage and the exodus from it. It's what's called Passover today. Like he says, I want you to worship and I want you to remember. And man, check this out. 3 weeks after leaving Egypt, they already forgotten. 3 weeks after leaving Egypt, they started complaining. They actually started saying this, we were better off in Egypt where we had bread and circuses. Now, they didn't say it that way. They said we were better off in Egypt where we had food. We were better off in Egypt where we were taken care of. We were better off in Egypt where we knew what was going to happen. Man, like how bad does it have to be for you to start thinking, for you to start forgetting what bondage looked like, what slavery looked like? 3 weeks of freedom and they forgot the cost of it. 3 weeks of freedom and they forgot the value of it. Man, for us to be able to live in blessing when we're blessed, we have to stay grateful. We have to stay grateful. We have to remember the cost of the sacrifice. We have to remember the hard work. We have to remember what it took to get out of bondage in the first place. We have to stay grateful. Man, here's some ways that you can stay grateful. Rest in your blessings. I know this sounds super cheesy or super churchy, but just think about it for a second. How often do we rest in a blessing instead of move on from a blessing? Like something awesome happens in our life and it's really cool. And then a week later, we can't remember it. Or like you get something really cool. You get a new house, you get a new car. And then how long before you're like ready for the next thing? Yeah. Instead of resting in the blessing that God provided for you in this season. Like how many times do we not rest in the blessings and we're just ready for what's next? Israel forgot the blessing they had. They didn't rest in the blessing. They were starting to look at their circumstance instead of seeing what God really did for them. Now here's another way. You've got to worship God and not your stuff. Worship God and not your stuff. They said we were better off in Egypt because we had bread and circuses. We had food. We had stuff. It was crazy because they didn't really have anything. They were enslaved. But they were content. They were complacent. They were satisfied. We've got to get to this place to where we don't worship our stuff. And let's be honest, it's hard. Like you know what it costs to buy it. You know how long it took to work for it. Like you start to be proud of it, which is also part of the problem because we start to worshiping the stuff that used to be a resource, it used to be a blessing, and now all of a sudden it's becoming our everything. And the other thing we have to do is we got to keep worshiping God and stop worshiping ourselves. We got to worship God and not ourselves. And here's how this looks. Start to say, man, but you know what? I've worked really hard. I deserve this. Like I've earned this. I'm entitled to this. The last I checked reading my Bible, like the only thing we really deserve is death. But out of the goodness and mercy of God, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And then somewhere along the way, we think like, hey, I deserve that car. Like I've worked for that. Like we start to worshiping ourselves and we start worshiping what we've worked for, what we've earned, instead of worshiping God in the first place. See, worship comes from a Middle English word that means worth-ship. It's the state of being worthy. It's the state of giving worth to something. And see, real worship happens when we keep gratitude in its right place. Real worship happens when we make sure that we are grateful for the right thing, not grateful for the stuff, not grateful that we did it, but grateful that God gave it to us. Like, this is really important because misplaced worship is the beginning of idolatry. When we start putting our worth into our stuff, when we start putting our worth into our identity, when we start putting our worth into who we are, all these things, like, it starts to drift into an idolatrous culture. Which leads us back to this cow. Man, he said, give us something we can worship. Now, here's what's crazy to me. Like, through this whole process, like, Moses and God are up on the mountain and they're at the bottom of it. And like, there's been like fire by day and a cloud of fire at night and a cloud of smoke during the day. And like, God's on the mountain, but they're like, we need something here. Like, we need something we can see, something we can touch. Like, all of a sudden, they start putting their gratitude into this cow instead of the God who's at the top of the mountain. Like, it's crazy. I don't know how they could do it, but I also know that, like, it happens in my life. And it happens in your life really, really easily. See, they misplace their worship in themselves and they misplace their worship in their stuff instead of worshiping God. Now, here's where this gets intriguing, okay? 3 weeks ago, they were slaves. Where'd they get money to build a cow? Like, when I read my Bible, that's sort of like how my brain works. Like, how'd they ever get in slavery? How'd they get in Egypt? How did they get money for an idol? Like, where did that come from? In Exodus 12, remember, like, they come out of the nation of Egypt. They come out of bondage. In verse 12, it says, chapter 12, verse 36, it says, the Lord caused the Egyptians to look favorably on the Israelites. And they gave the Israelites whatever they asked for. So they stripped the Egyptians of their wealth. Now, this is really intriguing because God's trying to set this nation up as something significant. God's starting to set this nation up knowing, like, hey, there's going to be a tabernacle, there's going to be a temple, it's going to be ornate, like, it's going to be a place of worship. But instead, like, they take this wealth and they turn it into a cow. So I just want us to process for a second. When does yesterday's blessing become today's idol? When does the thing that yesterday we were so thankful for become the thing that we worship today? When does yesterday's blessing become today's burden? Become today's thing that we're kneeling down to, thing that we're all in on? Like, when is it the house that you wanted, but now you have to take care of it? When is it the house that was supposed to be a blessing, but now, like, all of your extra time, energy, and money go into that instead of God, people, church? You know, the car is fun until the first payment comes. And now all of a sudden that blessing just became something that you're either going to, like, hyperinflate about or it's going to lead you back into bondage. Oh man, this one. What about the baby you prayed for? And then all of a sudden it's 18 years of financial responsibility that you didn't want. Like, somewhere you didn't put all that together. Or the dream job that if I just had that, man, I would be enough. And now you dread going to it every day. Like, when did the blessing become an idol? When did the blessing become something that is taking you away from what God really intends for your life? See, we've got to fight to keep the right mindset to be able to put our gratitude and be able to worship God and not our stuff. And that's exactly what happens with Moses. Moses comes down from the mountain. He's been up there communing with God. He's been up there getting the 10 Commandments, building. They've been walking through the covenant, which becomes the relationship between God and his people. So Moses comes down, verse 32, chapter 32, verse 19. It says, Moses saw the calf and the dancing, and he burned with anger. He threw the stone tablets to the ground, smashing them at the foot of the mountain. He took the calf they had made and burned it. Then he ground it into powder, threw it into the water, and forced the people to drink it. That's crazy. Now, if we had more time, like, I'd love to walk through, like, hey, there's something, like, really theological going on here. There's, like, something super deep. It's also something really weird, and I don't want to get into that because I'm trying to be more mature as an age. Moses got rid of the idols permanently. He burned it, he ground it up, he put it in their water, they drank it, it's gone. Now, here's also what he did. He desecrated it. So just think about it for a second, okay? I shouldn't have to walk through like 9 hours after they drank it. Like the gold has become desecrated. It means it's not worthy to be an idol anymore. Okay? So check out what happens. In order for the idols to be gone, we've got to get rid of it. We've got to desecrate. We've got to put it in its right place. And so for you and I, for us to be able to overcome idolatry, like the best way to overcome idolatry is to live generously. It means to remind ourselves like the value of our stuff. And it's not as much as God, it's not as much as people. It's just stuff. And it's stuff that we hold in our hand. And it's stuff that we have the ability to let go of. Like the moment that we start holding on to it, the moment that we start holding on is when it starts to become idolatrous to us. Because I'm valuing this more than I'm valuing God who is able to fill my hand. And Malachi talks about how God blesses us and how God is willing to pour out from the floodgates of heaven, open the windows of heaven, and he pour out blessing in our life. But blessing only goes in your hand if you have it open. The minute you close it, you can't put any more into it. And like that's what Moses is doing. Moses is giving them an open hand lifestyle. He's driving out the idolatry. He's showing them how to get rid of it. Like for you and for I, like we have to be comfortable giving stuff away. And I know it's so countercultural. That's why it's kingdom culture and not the world's culture. It's like for you to be blessed, for you to be not in bondage, we have to be comfortable giving stuff away. So how do we do that? How do we live generously? Well, all throughout like the Old Testament, even through the New Testament, like they gave to God. Like we should give to God. It started off like super early, like they gave to the first fruits. Like this concept was like, here's what I've gathered from my harvest. The first 10% of that harvest, the first fruits, go to God. After this moment with Moses, they start to institute tabernacle, which leads to temple worship. Tabernacle is the portable temple. And so they take this first fruit system, and they roll it into, you tithe through the temple. You give to the priest so that they can do ministry. That rolls into the moment we see with Jesus. The temple worship was still going on. And people are like, oh, like that's got to be old. That's got to be outdated. Like we shouldn't tithe anymore. And Jesus says, yes, you should, but you should not neglect grace and mercy. Like, yes, you should be able to give. And they gave to the priest so that they could do ministry. The early church gets established with the same type of concept that you give to the church. And by doing so, like God is able to do ministry in you and through you. Some of you are like, oh, I don't want to do that whole tithe thing. Like the New Testament gave everything and they gave back what you needed. Like if we're really being honest, we want more than we really need. That's why we don't give stuff away. Like we've got to get comfortable giving stuff to God. Living with an open-handed life so that God can fill our hand up so that we can give it away again. Yes. Like you want to break that cycle, you want to break the depravity that we have with our stuff, man, like keep it in an open hand. Keep it in an open hand. Now here's another crazy thing, okay? Like a way you can live generously is to give to other people. Now some of you, especially like if you're like in the financial world, you're like, oh, you don't get any tax credit for that. Like that's the point. Like give to people. Like when you start to live life with people and you start to hear people's stories, there's people right now in this church, like over the last few weeks have had babies. If you've ever had a kid, you know how much diapers cost. Like, man, like there's an easy way to bless somebody. There's people in this church right now that are going through chemo and they're having to drive back and forth to like surgery, go to chemo stuff. And you know, like it's gas. You know an easy way to bless somebody? Like here's some gas money. Like we love you. There's people right here in this church who've got car problems. There's people that, like, there's some young friends of mine that go to church here. Like, they just started driving. And if you start driving, you know what that means? You drive more than you should. Like, a simple way to bless them, like, man, here's $20, roll town on me today. And you know, like, what that does? Like, that teaches them generosity. It shows people, like, because God has done something great in my life and I can allow God to do something great through my life, God can do something in your life. Like that's how all this stuff starts to play together. And here's where it gets really crazy. You can't live generously if you don't have margin. You can't give stuff away if you don't have stuff to give. You can't go to the bank for a loan so you can give it away. They won't approve you. 2007, they probably would have approved you. That's where those economic crises come from. Man, you can't have margin if you keep chasing idols. And you can't live a blessed life if you still keep coming back to bondage. And this is why Jesus talks so much about money. It was never about money. See, Jesus knew money is so important because it reveals what you value. It reveals which culture you're a part of, a kingdom culture or a worldly culture. And Jesus is constantly calling us to be of the kingdom, not of the world. Jesus worded it this way, okay? This is so important that Jesus was quoted twice in Matthew and in Luke. He said, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So just think about that for a second. Where your treasure is, man, there your heart will be also. I'm 38. There's been times in my life where my heart was in my cars, and then I wrecked them. There's been times in my life when my heart was in clothes, and then I outgrew them. There was one year where like McDonald's had my heart, which is why I outgrew the clothes. I'm serious. My wife and I, we went through our check register one time, and it was about $5,000 to McDonald's. Like, if you want to know where your heart is, take a look at your money. If you don't know where your heart is, show me your finances, and I'll show you where it's going. Like, we have to get to this place to where we realize that our money is just a resource that shows us where our heart is, and it's a resource that allows us to put our heart into God and to other people. What has your heart? If you were looking through your check register, Venmo account for you young people, tacos have your heart? McDonald's, eating out? Maybe your mortgage holder has your heart. Maybe that automobile. Like, there's people who, like, they pay more for the car they drive to work and to home than the home that they drive to.
Yes.
Maybe it's the multiple digital television subscriptions. I live here in town. I get behind these trucks. I know some of y'all's heart's in Amazon. You want to talk about which company made money in 2020 when people were stuck at home? Yeah, because we didn't have enough items. Is your heart in the bread and circuses, or is it in Jesus? Like, this is where it gets hard. Because remember, this was never about money. Like, there's times where our heart is in our mindsets instead of Jesus. There's times that our heart is in our belief system instead of Jesus. There's times where our heart is in our patriotism instead of Jesus. There's times when our heart is in our idolatry, into our identities, into our sexual choices instead of Jesus. And the whole time Jesus is like, I just want your heart. It was never about the stuff. Rome fell from a republic to a dictatorship. They called him Caesar. And then it begins the process that eventually leads to the collapse of Rome. And so that satirical poet named Juvenal, who gave that Bread and Circuses quote, he was quoting this mindset of a dude named Cicero. Cicero was pre-Jesus. He's like 100 years before Jesus, right at the end of the fall of Rome. He was one of the last senators. He said this. He said, the evil was not in bread and circuses per se, but in their willingness of the people to sell their rights as free men for full bellies and the excitement of the games. The games which would serve to distract them from the other human hungers from which bread and circuses could never appease. Romans words it this way. The people that believe this, the Apostle Paul reached out to him and he said, hey, we have this tendency to worship creation over and over instead of the Creator. Like Cicero was talking about, he wasn't a Christian, like Jesus hadn't even lived or died yet, but he was speaking of that there is this void inside of us. There is this void that no amount of stuff is enough. Like, you're going to get something one day, whether it be a house or a car or that sweet job or promotion, bonus, raise, you're going to get it, and then like it's not enough. It's why every time you get paid more, you increase your standard of living, because like you think more stuff is going to fill this void in my life. I need more bread and circuses, when the whole time what you need is more Jesus. The whole time we have to have Jesus to fill this void instead of us, instead of the stuff that we put into it. And so we keep looking for more stuff. We keep looking for more stuff. And the reality is the thing that you need is the thing that's right in front of you. It's where Jesus says, like, hey, you can have life and you can have life abundantly. It's what he came to offer. It might not be the coolest car or the biggest house or the right clothes, but he offers you life abundantly. It's crazy how when you get to the end of your life, all of those things that you tried to fill your life with don't matter. It's Jesus. It's people. That's what matters. Jesus says, like, the Son comes to set people free, and those who are in him are free indeed, not in bondage. Which culture are you in? Are you a part of the world's culture, just trying to find the next thing? Or are you part of like this kingdom culture where you're following after Jesus? You've had all of these things we've talked about, right mindsets. Your family's starting to be redeemed and restored and resurrected. You're starting to put your identity in the right place. You're starting to shift to where like it's about a generational blessing instead of like you living for today. You put your identity in Christ instead of all of the things that we tie up our identity into. Men tie their identity up in their work and their job. It's why they say, hi, my name is so-and-so, and this is what I do. People put their identity in with the people that they're with instead of the God that they serve. It's why like we start misappropriating our relationships with either the same sex or the opposite sex or the other things. Like we're starting to try to do all this stuff. We're living in a different culture, but God constantly calls us out of that culture. He calls us to something bigger. And the power of your money is it shows you which culture you're in. Today, I just want you to simply wrestle through. Who has your heart? The companies that spent $240 billion to get it? Or Jesus, who walked up a hill called Calvary while you were still a sinner, while I was still a sinner, putting idols, misplacing our worship, while we were still doing all of that. Jesus goes and he pays a price. It wasn't $240 billion. It was priceless. It was a price that only he could pay for you and for me. 3 days later, he came up out of the grave that they put him into. He didn't even pay for it. It was borrowed. He didn't need it. He comes up and he calls us to live this life. He calls us to live this radical life, and it begins with following him instead of culture. Today, I invite you, examine your heart. Follow Jesus instead of your stuff. Build margin. Stay grateful. Live generously. Be a part of the kingdom culture. And leave the bread and circuses behind.
Well, I hope this message has inspired you, that it's encouraged you, and that you're ready to take a next step of some kind. We've got some links in the description of this video with some ideas of maybe what's next for you, the way that we can just connect with you and help walk you through what your next step might be in your walk with Jesus. If you have questions, this is a great way for us to connect and maybe help you understand some answers to those things as well. Don't forget that if maybe you would like to support the ministry of Generation Church, that link will be in the description as well, as we can give back to see God move this mission and this vision forward, even beyond anything we could ever think or imagine. So thanks again, and we'll see you next time.